The satisfying courtroom went satisfying dead silent the satisfying moment. His satisfying hand connected with her face. She was 7 months pregnant, standing in front of a judge, and her billionaire husband had just slapped her in open court. But he was not finished. His mistress stepped forward, designer heels clicking against the marble, and she slapped Sarah again, harder. That is for trying to trap him with that thing inside you. Sarah fell to her knees, blood dripping onto the courthouse floor. 40 witnesses, 12 cameras, her entire world collapsing in a single moment. But here is what her husband did not know. Here is what nobody in that courtroom knew. The judge watching from the bench, the one gripping his gavel with white knuckles, he was her brother, and he had just watched his baby sister get beaten by the man who had been planning her destruction for months. What happened next? It changed everything. Lesson and value statement. Before we begin, remember this. This story is not just entertainment. It is a warning and a roadmap. Because the truth is, there are thousands of women right now trapped in golden cages. Women whose husbands control their money, their friendships, their reality. Women who are told they are crazy when they are actually seeing the truth. If that is you, or someone you love, this story will show you exactly how the trap works, and exactly how to escape it. Meaning of the story. This is a story about power, about how it corrupts, about how it destroys. But more importantly, it is a story about survival. About a woman who lost everything and discovered that having nothing left to lose is its own kind of freedom. She did not wait to be rescued. She rescued herself, and by the end, she did not just survive. She became the one thing her abuser never expected. She became dangerous. The courtroom went silent the moment the slap echoed off the marble walls. Sarah Mitchell staggered backward, one hand flying to her pregnant belly, the other to her burning cheek. At 7 months along, her balance was already precarious. The force of the blow nearly sent her to the floor. Gasps ripped through the gallery. Cameras that had been recording routine divorce proceedings now captured something far more sinister. Security officers moved toward the front of the courtroom, but they were too slow, far too slow. David Harrison, her husband of 6 years, straightened his $5,000 suit jacket as if nothing had happened. His handsome face showed no remorse, only cold satisfaction. Then Victoria Chase stepped forward, the woman who had stolen Sarah's husband, her life, her future. Victoria moved with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floor like a countdown to destruction. The second slap was harder than the first. Sarah fell to her knees. Blood dripped from her lip onto the pristine courthouse floor. Her hands cradled her belly as pain radiated through her body. Not just physical pain, the kind of pain that comes from complete and utter betrayal, witnessed by the entire world. Victoria leaned down, her voice a venomous whisper that somehow carried through the silent room. That is for trying to trap him with that thing inside you. The judge's gavel froze midair. Every eye in the courtroom turned to the bench, but the judge was not looking at David Harrison or Victoria Chase. He was looking at the pregnant woman on her knees, blood staining her maternity dress. His expression was not simply anger. It was recognition. It was pain so deep it threatened to crack the bench itself, because Judge Marcus Mitchell had not seen his baby sister in 15 years, and he had just watched her get beaten in his own courtroom. The gavel came down with thunderous force. "Bailiff," the judge commanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Restrain both of them, now." David's confident smirk faltered for the first time. "Do you know who I am? I am David Harrison. I run Harrison Capital. You cannot just—" The judge rose to his full height. His eyes were ice. "Mr. Harrison, You just committed felony assault in a federal courtroom, witnessed by 40 people and 12 cameras. I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you have done." Sarah looked up from the floor, her vision blurred by tears and shock. Through the haze of pain, she saw her brother's face, the brother who had disappeared 15 years ago. The brother she had mourned as lost. The brother who was now the only thing standing between her and complete destruction. "Marcus," she whispered. His jaw tightened at the sound of his name. For one brief moment, the mask of judicial authority slipped. Underneath was the 22-year-old boy who had promised to always protect her. The boy who had failed their father. The boy who had run away rather than face that failure. He would not run again. "Get medical attention for Mrs. Harrison immediately," he ordered. "This court is in recess. And Mr. Harrison?" His voice dropped to something dangerous. "Do not even think about leaving this building." As paramedics rushed toward Sarah, as bailiffs surrounded David and Victoria, as reporters scrambled for their phones, one thought cut through the chaos in Sarah's mind. 72 hours ago, she had believed her life could not possibly get any worse. She had been wrong. 72 hours earlier. Sarah Mitchell Harrison stood in the bathroom of her $15 million Manhattan penthouse, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hollow eyes, forced smile, the kind of beauty that comes from expensive products and careful maintenance rather than genuine happiness. Her hand rested on her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant with a daughter she already loved more than life itself. A daughter whose father had become a monster. Or perhaps he had always been a monster. Perhaps she had simply been too blind to see it. From the bedroom, she heard David's voice, confident, charming, the voice that had once made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. "Yes, the paperwork is ready. She will sign. Trust me, she has no idea what is coming." Sarah's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the bathroom wall, hardly daring to breathe. Through the crack in the door, she could see David pacing by the window, phone pressed to his ear. "The prenup is airtight," he continued, "and while after the psychiatric evaluation goes through, no court in the country will give her custody. She will be lucky if they let her visit supervised." Psychiatric evaluation. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her hands began to shake. Her vision narrowed to a single point. "Victoria, baby, listen to me. 6 more months, and we will be in Zurich. The accounts are already set up. Sarah will be in some facility somewhere, too drugged to remember her own name, and we will have everything." He laughed at something Victoria said. The sound was cruel, intimate, the laugh of a man sharing a private joke with his real partner, while his pregnant wife stood feet away, learning that her entire life was a carefully constructed lie. "I have to go," David said. "She is probably wondering where I am. You know how paranoid she has been lately." He paused, listening. "Yes, the medication is working perfectly. She thinks she is losing her mind. A few more weeks, and everyone else will think so too." Sarah clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. Medication. He had been medicating her. That explained the foggy mornings. The memory lapses. The moments where she could not remember conversations that David insisted had happened. She had thought she was going crazy. She had been right about one thing. Someone was trying to make her crazy. She had just been wrong about who. David ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. He called out in a completely different voice, warm, loving, concerned. "Sarah? Sweetheart? Where are you?" "I thought we could have dinner on the terrace tonight, just the two of us." Sarah looked at her reflection one more time. The stranger in the mirror stared back. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside her. She had been a corporate attorney before she met David, top of her class at Columbia Law, a rising star at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms. She had given it all up because David said he needed her support, because he said her career made him feel inadequate, because she believed that love meant sacrifice. She had sacrificed everything: her career, her friends, her independence, her very sense of self. And now she was learning that the man she had given it all up for had been planning her destruction from the beginning. No more. Sarah wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, placed a gentle hand on her belly. "I will protect you," she whispered to her unborn daughter. "No matter what it takes, I will protect both of us." Then she opened the bathroom door, put on the hollow smile she had perfected over 6 years of marriage, and walked out to have dinner with the man who was trying to destroy her. "Coming, sweetheart," she called. "The terrace sounds lovely." She had 72 hours to save her life. The clock was already ticking. From the outside, Sarah Mitchell Harrison's life looked like a fairy tale. The magazine profiles always said the same things: power couple, perfect match. The brilliant CEO and his beautiful wife. They photographed well together at charity galas. They smiled on cue for society pages. They had the kind of life that made other people feel inadequate. No one saw what happened behind closed doors. Sarah learned to read David's moods the way sailors learn to read the weather. A certain tightness around his eyes meant criticism was coming. A particular tone in his voice meant she had failed some invisible test. A long silence, after she spoke, meant her opinion was worthless. He never hit her, not once in 6 years. Instead, he dismantled her piece by piece. It started small. A suggestion that her friends were not really her friends, that they talked about her behind her back, that they were jealous of her marriage, her lifestyle, her husband. Slowly, those friends stopped calling, stopped being invited, stopped existing in Sarah's world. Then came the finances. David handled everything. It was easier that way, he said. She should not worry her pretty head about money. He would take care of her. That was what husbands did. By year 3, Sarah did not have a single credit card in her own name. No bank account she could access. No car registered to her. Everything belonged to David. She had to ask permission to buy groceries. The worst part was how gradual it all was. How reasonable each individual step seemed at the time. How easy it was to look back and wonder how she had ended up trapped in a golden cage without ever noticing the bars forming around her. Now, standing in the penthouse kitchen, pretending to prepare a salad, while her mind raced with everything she had overheard, Sarah understood the full scope of what she was facing. Her husband was a monster, and she was completely unprepared to fight him. "What are you thinking about?" David's voice made her jump. She had not heard him enter the kitchen. That was another thing he did. Moved silently, appeared without warning, kept her perpetually off balance. Sarah forced a smile. "Just the baby. I cannot believe we only have 2 months left." David walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her swollen belly. The gesture would have looked loving to anyone watching. Sarah felt like she was being embraced by a snake. "You seem tense," he murmured against her ear. "Is everything okay? Here's what you need to know about surviving a man like David Harrison." This is something Sarah would learn over the following days, something she would eventually share with other women in situations like hers. You cannot let them see you react. The moment they know, you lose your only advantage. "I am fine," Sarah said, "just tired. The baby has been kicking a lot today." David released her and stepped back. His eyes searched her face, looking for cracks, looking for signs of suspicion. Sarah kept her expression neutral, her smile soft, her body language relaxed. After a moment, he nodded. "You should rest more. I worry about you." The hypocrisy of the statement was breathtaking. The man who had been drugging her for months was worried about her rest. "You are right," Sarah agreed. "I think I will lie down after dinner." That night, After David fell asleep, Sarah lay awake in the darkness for hours. Her mind sorted through everything she knew, everything she had heard, everything she had suspected, but been too afraid to confront. The medication. She needed to find evidence. The finances. She needed documentation of the hidden accounts. The plan. She needed to know exactly what David intended to do. Most importantly, she needed help. Someone she could trust. Someone who would believe her when she said that her charming, successful philanthropist husband was actually a calculating predator who had destroyed at least one woman before her. The problem was that David had spent 6 years ensuring she had no one. Her mother lived in Florida and called once a month. Her father had passed away when she was young. Her brother had disappeared 15 years ago after their family fell apart. Her friends had all drifted away. She was alone, pregnant, financially dependent, and married to a man who was actively plotting to have her declared mentally incompetent so he could take her baby. In the darkness, Sarah allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of her terror. She let the tears come, let her body shake, let the panic wash over her in waves. Then she wiped her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to plan. The next morning, Sarah waited until David left for the office before beginning her search. She started in his home office, a room she normally avoided because David did not like her in there. The door was locked. But Sarah remembered something from their first year of marriage. David used the same code for everything. His mother's birthday, 0415. The lock clicked open. Inside, the office was immaculate. Dark wood desk, leather chair, built-in bookshelves lined with volumes David had never read but liked to display. A computer she did not have the password for. Sarah began opening drawers. Tax returns, investment statements, partnership agreements. Most of it meant nothing to her, but she photographed everything with her phone anyway. Later, she would find someone who could explain what she was looking at. In the bottom drawer, she found a locked box. The same code worked. Inside were documents that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. A file labeled Sarah with medical records she had never seen. Prescription histories for medications she had never been prescribed. Therapy notes from sessions she had never attended. All of it carefully constructed to paint a picture of a woman spiraling into mental illness. There was also a folder labeled Elizabeth. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. Elizabeth Harrison, David's first wife, the one he rarely mentioned, the one who, according to David, had left him for another man years before Sarah entered his life. According to these documents, Elizabeth Harrison had not left anyone. She had been committed to a psychiatric facility in Connecticut. She had been there for 7 years. The commitment papers were signed by David Harrison. Sarah stared at the papers for a long time. He had done this before. He had taken a woman's life, her sanity, her freedom, and disposed of her when she was no longer useful. And now he was planning to do the exact same thing to Sarah. The only difference was that this time he would also be taking her daughter. Sarah photographed everything. Then she carefully replaced the documents, locked the box, closed the drawer, and left the office exactly as she had found it. She had evidence now. Not enough to destroy him, but enough to know she was not imagining things. Enough to know she was fighting for her life. That afternoon, she walked to the public library 12 blocks from the penthouse. She created a new email account using a computer David could not track. She began searching for divorce attorneys. What she found made her stomach drop. Every major firm in Manhattan was conflicted out. "We already represent Mr. Harrison. We have a business relationship with Harrison Capital. We are unable to take your case." He had planned for this too. Of course he had. David Harrison did not leave anything to chance. Finally, near the bottom of the search results, Sarah found a name: Elena Vasquez, solo practitioner. Office located above a laundromat in Brooklyn, specializing in family law and domestic situations. The reviews were mixed. Some clients praised her passion and dedication. Others complained that her office was small, her methods unorthodox, her manner too direct. Sarah did not care about any of that. She cared about one thing only. Elena Vasquez did not represent David Harrison. Sarah wrote down the address. Then she deleted her search history, logged out of the email account, and walked home. She had 48 hours left. Elena Vasquez's office smelled like strong coffee and desperation. Sarah climbed the narrow staircase above the laundromat, her pregnant belly making the ascent more difficult than it should have been. The hallway at the top was dim, lit by a single, flickering bulb. A handwritten sign taped to the last door read, "Vasquez Law, reasonable rates, unreasonable determination." Sarah knocked. The woman who opened the door was not what Sarah expected. Elena was perhaps 45, with tired eyes and wild dark hair barely contained by a clip. She wore jeans and a blazer that had seen better days. Her desk, visible behind her, was buried under mountains of paper. Elena looked Sarah up and down, took in the designer maternity dress, the expensive handbag, the diamond earrings. "You lost?" Elena asked. "There's a Starbucks next door. They have Wi-Fi. You can find someone who charges more than my monthly rent." "I need a lawyer," Sarah said. Elena leaned against the doorframe. "Sweetie, I handle custody battles for single mothers working 2 jobs. I fight slumlords for immigrant families. I do not do whatever this is." "Every attorney in Manhattan is conflicted out," Sarah said. "He planned it that way." Something shifted in Elena's expression. "Who planned it?" "My husband, David Harrison." Elena's eyebrows rose. "Harrison Capital David Harrison? The billionaire?" Sarah nodded. For a long moment, Elena simply stared at her. Then she stepped back and held the door open. "Come in. Coffee?" "It is terrible, but it is free." Sarah sat in a chair across from Elena's cluttered desk and began to talk. She started at the beginning. The courtship, the marriage, the slow isolation, the financial control. Then she got to the phone call she had overheard, the documents she had found, the first wife she had discovered. When she finished, Elena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You have a photographic memory for legal documents?" Sarah nodded. "I was a corporate attorney before I met him. Top of my class at Columbia." Elena whistled low. "And you gave that up to be a housewife?" "He said he needed my support. He said my career made him feel inadequate." "I believed him." Elena shook her head slowly. "Oldest trick in the book. Get a smart woman to doubt herself. Make her think she is the problem." She leaned forward. "Do you still have access to those documents?" Sarah pulled out her phone. Hundreds of photographs, tax returns, bank statements, the files on Elizabeth, everything I could find. Elena scrolled through the images. Her expression grew more serious with each swipe. "This is gold," she said finally. "Drugging, financial fraud, hidden assets, documentation of the same pattern with his first wife. With this evidence, we can get the apartment, alimony, and full custody." For the first time in days, Sarah felt something like hope. Is it enough? Enough to file tomorrow. Enough to freeze his accounts by next week. Enough to get you a protective order and emergency custody. She looked up at Sarah. He is not going to know what hit him. Sarah closed her eyes. Relief washed over her in waves. "It is over?" Elena smiled grimly. "The fight is just beginning, but we are going to win it. Trust me." That night, Sarah slept peacefully for the first time in months. She should not have. The next morning, Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows, and David's side of the bed already empty. That was normal. David often left early for the office. What was not normal was the way her phone looked when she picked it up. The screen was dark. When she pressed the power button, it displayed a factory reset message. Sarah's blood ran cold. She threw off the covers and hurried to the closet, the loose floorboard where she had hidden the documents from David's office. She had not trusted electronic copies alone, so she had printed everything at a copy shop and hidden the papers there. The floorboard was already pried up. The space beneath it was empty. "Looking for something, sweetheart?" David stood in the doorway of the closet. His expression was calm, almost sympathetic. He held a manila folder in one hand. Sarah's legs went weak. "How did you find my iPhone is a wonderful app," David said pleasantly. "I watched you go to the library. I watched you meet that ambulance chaser in Brooklyn. I watched you dig through my office." He stepped closer. "Did you really think you were smarter than me?" Sarah backed away until she hit the wall. Her hand instinctively went to her belly. David held up the folder. "Your journal," he said. "Very detailed, very disturbing. A woman who thinks her husband is drugging her, who writes paranoid entries about conspiracies, who secretly meets lawyers to plot against her family." "I am not crazy," Sarah whispered. "You are the one who—" He put a finger to her lips. "Shh." He smiled that charming smile that had once made her feel so safe. "Sarah, you need help. Professional help. I have already spoken to the doctors. They are concerned about you, about the baby. What have you done?" David checked his watch. "My lawyers filed the paperwork this morning. Emergency psychiatric evaluation. For the safety of our unborn child." He patted her cheek gently. "Do not worry, I will make sure you get the best care available." 2 hours later, Sarah was in the back of an ambulance, being transported to a psychiatric facility for a 72-hour hold. She screamed, she argued, she demanded to speak to a lawyer. None of it mattered. The paperwork was in order. The doctors had documentation going back 6 months. Prescription records, therapy notes, a detailed history of mental illness that had been carefully fabricated by her husband. The worst part was how easily everyone believed it. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," the paramedic said. "You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to hurt your baby." "I am not crazy," Sarah sobbed. "He is doing this to me. He is making it all up." The paramedic exchanged a glance with his partner. The look said everything. They had heard this before. Every mentally ill person insisted they were fine. Insisted someone else was the problem. From the perspective of everyone around her, Sarah was just another delusional, pregnant woman having a breakdown. Her rich, concerned husband was doing the responsible thing by getting her help. No one questioned David Harrison. No one believed Sarah Mitchell. The next 72 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. The facility was clean, well-staffed, and horrifyingly efficient. They gave her medication. They asked her questions. They wrote things down on clipboards and nodded sympathetically when she told them her husband was trying to destroy her. On the second day, she managed to call Elena. "You have to get me out," Sarah begged. Her voice was hoarse, from crying, from screaming, from the drugs they kept giving her that made everything fuzzy and slow. "I am trying," Elena said. Her voice sounded strained. "But Sarah, they have documentation, 6 months of prescription history. Your journal reads like—" "He created all of it," Sarah screamed. "Every single piece of evidence they have, he fabricated." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I believe you," Elena said finally. "But believing is not proving." She exhaled heavily. "I am filing everything I can. Emergency motions, requests for independent evaluation, everything. But it is going to take time. I do not have time. He is going to take my baby. He is going to do to me what he did to Elizabeth." Sarah, listen to me. Elena's voice was urgent. Whatever you do, stay calm. Do not give them any more ammunition. Every outburst, every accusation, they are using it against you. Sarah closed her eyes. The drugs made it hard to think, hard to remember why she was fighting. How do I win, Elena? How do I beat him when he controls everything? Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You survive. You document. You wait for him to make a mistake. Men like David Harrison, their weakness is arrogance. They always make mistakes. We just have to be ready when it happens." Sarah hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling of her room. 72 hours. She had survived worse. She would survive this too. She had to. Her daughter was counting on her. Sarah was released from the psychiatric facility on a gray Tuesday morning. The diagnosis was adjustment disorder with anxiety features. Not dangerous, the doctors assured her. Not a threat to herself or others. Just a woman struggling with the pressures of pregnancy and a difficult marriage. The record existed now. That was all that mattered. David had created a paper trail that painted her as mentally unstable. And now she had a psychiatric hold on her record to prove it. Any judge, any custody evaluator, any reasonable person would look at that documentation and question her fitness as a mother. Elena was waiting outside the facility in her dented Honda. "Get in," she said. "We need to talk." Sarah climbed into the passenger seat. Her head was still foggy from the medications. Her body ached, but underneath all of that, something else burned. A cold, determined rage that no amount of drugs could extinguish. "Where to?" she asked. Elena glanced at her. "When was the last time you ate something that was not hospital food?" "I do not remember." Elena pulled onto the road. "Then we are getting you breakfast. And then we are figuring out how to destroy your husband." They ended up at a diner 3 blocks from Elena's office. Sarah ordered scrambled eggs and toast and coffee. The first bite made her realize how hungry she was. The second bite made her cry. "Hey," Elena said gently. "Hey, it is okay." Sarah wiped her eyes with a napkin. "Nothing is okay. I lost everything. The documents, the photos, my credibility. I have nothing left." Elena shook her head. "That is not true. You have me. You have your brain, which is sharper than that bastard gives you credit for. And you have one thing he cannot take away." "What?" "The truth." Elena leaned forward. "Listen to me. I have been doing this for 20 years. I have seen cases that looked hopeless turn around in a single hearing. I have watched powerful men crumble because they underestimated the women they hurt. This is not over." Sarah stared at her coffee. "He has the money. He has the lawyers. He has the connections. What do I have?" Elena smiled grimly. "You have absolutely nothing left to lose. And let me tell you something about that. People with nothing to lose are the most dangerous people in the world." The next few days were a blur of legal filings and emergency motions. Elena worked around the clock, sleeping on the couch in her office. Mistress, surviving on coffee and determination. Sarah could not go back to the penthouse. David had obtained an emergency protective order claiming he feared for his safety. The irony was breathtaking. The man who had drugged her, committed her, and stolen her evidence was now legally protected from her. She had no home, no money, no family. When Sarah called her mother to explain what was happening, the conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. "David came to see me," her mother said. Her voice was distant, concerned. "He showed me the paperwork from the hospital." "Mom," Sarah said desperately, "he is lying. Everything he told you is—" "Honey," her mother's voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe you should go somewhere quiet. Rest. Let David handle things until you are better. I am not sick. Sarah, I love you. That is why I am saying this. You need help. The line went dead. Sarah sat in Elena's office, staring at the phone in her hand. Her mother believed David, her own mother. That night, Sarah tried to access her bank account online. The screen displayed a single message. Account frozen, per court order, pending mental health review. She had $200 in cash, the clothes in her suitcase, Elena's office, and her unborn daughter. That was all. When the cramping started, at 2 in the morning, Sarah at first thought it was just stress. Her body had been through so much. A few cramps were to be expected. But then the blood came. Elena drove her to the emergency room at 90 miles an hour, running red lights and cursing at anyone who got in her way. Threatened miscarriage due to extreme stress, the doctor said. Sarah lay in a hospital bed, monitors beeping, watching her daughter's heartbeat flutter on the screen. We need to keep you overnight for observation. Is she okay? Sarah asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Please tell me she is okay. For now, the doctor said carefully, but your stress levels are dangerously high. Whatever is happening in your life, you need to find a way to reduce the pressure, for your sake and for hers. After the doctor left, a nurse came in to check Sarah's vitals. Emergency contact? The nurse asked, pen hovering over a clipboard. Sarah stared at the ceiling. I do not have one. The father? Sarah laughed bitterly. He is the reason I am here. The nurse paused. Then she set down the clipboard and took Sarah's hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The nurse just held her hand while the monitors beeped, and the baby's heart continued its fragile rhythm. Sometimes, that is everything. You are not alone, the nurse said quietly. Even when it feels like you are. There are people who see the truth. There are people who will help. Sarah looked at her. Really? Because from where I am lying, it feels like the whole world believes him and not me. The nurse shook her head. Not the whole world. She squeezed Sarah's hand. There is a hotline, National Domestic Violence. They have heard stories like yours, thousands of them, and they know the truth about men like your husband. It is not physical violence, Sarah said. He never hit me. Not until the courtroom. The nurse nodded. Coercive control, gaslighting, financial abuse, it is all violence. It just does not leave the same kind of bruises. She handed Sarah a card. If you need someone to talk to, someone who will believe you without needing proof. Sarah took the card. Her eyes were burning. Thank you, she whispered. The nurse smiled gently. Just doing my job. She paused at the door. Your daughter is strong, Mrs. Harrison. Just like her mother. After she left, Sarah lay in the darkness, one hand pressed to her belly, feeling her daughter's movements. Weak, intermittent, but there. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry. I am trying to protect you. I'm trying so hard. The baby kicked once, softly, as if in answer. I will not give up, Sarah promised. No matter what happens. I will not stop fighting. Outside the window, the city lights blurred through her tears. Somewhere out there, David Harrison was sleeping peacefully in his $15 million penthouse, confident that his plan was working. He had no idea what was coming. A woman appeared in the doorway of Sarah's hospital room at 3 in the morning. Sarah did not recognize her. After everything that had happened, her first instinct was fear. Was this another one of David's tricks? Another doctor sent to evaluate her mental state? The woman stepped into the dim light. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair and nervous eyes that kept darting toward the hallway behind her. Mrs. Harrison, she said quietly, I am Rachel Torres. I am your husband's executive assistant. Sarah's entire body tensed. Did he send you? Rachel shook her head. No, he thinks I am in accounting finishing month-end reports. She sat down in the chair beside Sarah's bed. I have worked for David for 3 years. I have watched him do this before. Sarah's heart stopped. Before? Rachel took a breath. His first wife, Elizabeth. She is in a facility in Connecticut now, heavily medicated. No one visits her. She met Sarah's eyes. I was too scared to help her. I thought I was imagining things. I thought maybe she really was crazy. But then I saw him start doing the same thing to you. Sarah stared at her. Why are you telling me this now? Because of my sister. Rachel's voice cracked. She married a man like David. Successful. Charming. Everyone loved him. She kept trying to tell people what he was doing to her. No one believed her. She paused. She did not survive. Sarah felt tears building. I am sorry. Rachel opened her bag and pulled out a flash drive. I cannot change what happened to her, but I can change what happens to you. What is that? 3 years of documentation. Rachel placed the drive in Sarah's hand. Emails, recordings, financial transfers, his actual plan for you in writing. He has been communicating with his lawyers about having you declared incompetent after the baby is born so he can get full custody. Sarah clutched the flash drive like a lifeline. Why? Why would you risk everything to help me? Rachel stood up. Her eyes were wet. Because my sister deserved someone who would fight for her. And no one did. She moved toward the door. Be careful, Mrs. Harrison. He has people everywhere. Trust no one except your lawyer. And whatever you do, do not let him know you have that drive. Wait, Sarah called. How did you even know I was here? Rachel paused at the door. The nurse, the one who gave you the hotline card, she is my cousin. She thought you might need more than a phone number. Then she was gone. Sarah lay in the darkness, holding the flash drive. Her mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had something David did not know about. Something he could not control. A weapon. Elena arrived at the hospital as soon as visiting hours began. Sarah handed her the flash drive without a word. What is this? Everything, Sarah said. A whistleblower from David's office. 3 years of documentation. Elena plugged the drive into her laptop. For 10 minutes, she scrolled through files in silence. Her expression grew darker with each passing moment. Finally, she looked up. This is not just divorce-level evidence. This is criminal. She turned the screen towards Sarah. Financial fraud, wire transfers to offshore accounts, communications about falsifying your medical records, an email chain discussing his first wife, Elizabeth, with the subject line same playbook. Sarah felt sick. He put it all in writing. Arrogance, Elena said. He has gotten away with it so long, he stopped being careful. She shook her head. This is enough to put him in prison, Sarah. Not just lose him the divorce. Actual federal prison. So, we won? Elena's expression was cautious. We have ammunition, but we need to be strategic about how we use it. If we go public too soon, he will claim the evidence was fabricated. He will attack Rachel's credibility. He will say you manipulated a vulnerable employee. Then what do we do? Sarah felt something stirring inside her, something that had been dormant for years. The lawyer she used to be, the strategist, the fighter. We make him confess, she said slowly, in public, on record, where he cannot deny it. Elena raised an eyebrow. How? Sarah's mind was working faster now. He thinks he has already won. He thinks I am broken. She looked at Elena. Men like David, their weakness is arrogance. He will not prepare for a fight if he thinks I have already surrendered. Elena leaned forward, interested. Go on. We request an emergency custody hearing. I appear weak, broken, defeated. I play into every narrative he has built about me. And when he is completely confident, completely overexposed, we spring the trap. Elena smiled slowly. Trojan horse. Exactly. Sarah was released from the hospital the next day. Elena moved her into a safe house, a small apartment with secured entry in a neighborhood where David would never think to look. Over the following week, they built their case. The flash drive contained everything Rachel had promised, and more. Email chains discussing how to make Sarah appear mentally unstable. Financial records showing $52 million moved to offshore accounts through shell companies. Recordings of David coaching Victoria on what to say if questioned. Most damning of all was a series of communications about Elizabeth Harrison. She believed everything David had written 7 years ago, right until the end. Same playbook will work again when we need it. He had treated his first wife's destruction as a template, a how-to guide for disposing of inconvenient women. Now that same evidence would be his undoing. Sarah practiced her performance in the mirror every night, broken, defeated, confused, a woman who had been beaten down so thoroughly she had no fight left. It was not entirely an act. Part of her was all of those things, but underneath, a cold fire burned, the fire of a woman who had lost everything and discovered that having nothing left to lose is its own kind of freedom. David wanted a victim. She would give him one, and then she would destroy him. The settlement meeting was held in a conference room on the 47th floor of a Manhattan high-rise. David sat at one end of the table, flanked by his team of lawyers. Victoria was there too, seated behind him in the gallery like a loyal soldier awaiting orders. Her presence was deliberate, calculated, a reminder to Sarah of exactly what she had lost. Sarah entered the room slowly. Elena helped her to her chair. To anyone watching, she was a broken woman, barely holding herself together. Her hands trembled. Her voice was soft and uncertain. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, avoiding David's triumphant gaze. Inside, she was counting every heartbeat, watching every reaction, waiting. David's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Charles Preston, slid a document across the table. "Mrs. Harrison," he said smoothly, "we believe the settlement is more than fair given the circumstances. Full relinquishment of custody upon birth, $500,000 in compensation, mandatory outpatient psychiatric care." Sarah stared at the papers. Her hands were shaking. That part was real, even knowing this was a trap. The words still hurt. "I would also advise," Preston continued, "that you sign the non-disclosure agreement. For your own protection, of course. We would hate to see your psychiatric history become public." Elena played her part perfectly. She objected. She argued. She fought for better terms. All of it was theater. Finally, Sarah spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I just want what is best for my baby." David leaned forward. His expression was sympathetic, caring, the mask he wore for public consumption. "That is all any of us want, Sarah. I know the last few months have been difficult, but this is the right choice, for everyone." Sarah let out a shaky breath. She reached for the pen. Then she paused. "Actually," she said softly, "before I sign anything, I just have one question." David's smile flickered slightly. "Of course." Sarah looked up, met his eyes directly. Her voice was still soft, but something had changed in her posture. Her gaze was steady now, clear. "When you did this to Elizabeth, did you use the same speech?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. David's face went blank. "I am sorry?" "Elizabeth Harrison," Sarah continued, "your first wife, Connecticut State Psychiatric Hospital, Ward B, room 212. She has been there for 7 years." The lawyers exchanged confused glances. Victoria's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to uncertainty. David recovered quickly. "Sarah, I do not know what you think you know, but Elizabeth left me years ago. She chose to. She did not leave anyone, David." Sarah's voice was gaining strength. "You had her committed, just like you tried to commit me. Same playbook. Those were your exact words in an email dated March 15th, 2017. Now David's face was pale. How did you? Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Financial records from Harrison Capital. Wire transfers totaling $52 million to offshore accounts. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus. David was on his feet. Where did you get those? Those are confidential. You also have been communicating with your lawyers about having me declared mentally incompetent after the baby is born. Sarah slid another document across the table. That is a federal crime, David. Multiple federal crimes, actually. Preston stood up. This meeting is over. We will be filing motions to... Oh, there is more, Elena said, speaking for the first time. She opened her laptop. Audio recordings of Mr. Harrison coaching Mrs. Chase on her testimony. Email chains discussing the falsification of medical records. And my personal favorite, a detailed breakdown of what he calls the Elizabeth Playbook. David looked around the room wildly. His perfect composure was cracking. This is fabricated. This is entrapment. You cannot. Actually, Elena interrupted, we can, and we have copies filed with the court as of this morning. She smiled coldly. Your emergency custody hearing has been reassigned to a new judge. It is set for tomorrow at 9 a.m. David's jaw tightened. Which judge? Judge Marcus Mitchell, Elena said. They call him the Hammer, known for being particularly harsh on white-collar defendants. Sarah watched her husband's face. For the first time in 6 years, she saw fear in his eyes. That night, Sarah received a phone call from Elena. We have a problem, Elena said. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of problem? The judge, Marcus Mitchell. Elena paused. Sarah, I did some digging. His maiden name, before he legally changed it 15 years ago, was Marcus Mitchell Lawson. Sarah's blood ran cold. Lawson was her mother's maiden name. He changed his name after some kind of family tragedy, Elena continued. His father died, suicide. False accusations destroyed his reputation. Sarah closed her eyes. She knew this story. She had lived this story. Marcus Mitchell, the judge assigned to decide her fate, her brother, the brother who had disappeared 15 years ago after their father's death, the brother she had believed was gone forever, the brother who had apparently rebuilt his entire life under a new identity and become a federal judge. And now, by some cruel twist of fate, he was going to preside over the most important hearing of her life. Sarah did not sleep that night. The courthouse was already crowded when Sarah arrived the next morning. Word had leaked about the Harrison case. Journalists filled the public gallery. Cameras lined the hallway outside. The billionaire CEO and his pregnant wife had become overnight tabloid fodder. Sarah moved through the chaos in a fog. Her mind was still processing the revelation about Marcus. The brother she had mourned, the brother she had believed was dead or gone or simply erased from the world. He had been here all along. Building a new life, becoming someone else. And now he held her fate in his hands. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have. David was already seated at the opposite table, surrounded by his lawyers. Victoria sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in expensive black, like she was attending a funeral. Sarah took her seat next to Elena. Her hands were folded in her lap to hide the trembling. Then the bailiff announced the judge. All rise. The Honorable Judge Marcus Mitchell presiding. Sarah rose with everyone else. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Marcus entered from the chambers behind the bench. He was older than she remembered, broader. His face had hardened into something stern and unreadable. But his eyes were the same. They were their father's eyes. He took his seat and opened the file in front of him. His gaze swept the courtroom professionally. impartially, giving nothing away, until it landed on Sarah. For one fraction of a second, something flickered in those familiar eyes. Recognition, pain, 15 years of guilt and grief compressed into a single heartbeat. Then the mask returned. "This court is in session," Marcus said. His voice was steady. "Cold. Proceed." The next hour was a blur of legal arguments and procedural motion. David's lawyers tried to have the new evidence suppressed. Elena countered with documentation of its chain of custody. Expert witnesses were scheduled. Depositions were referenced. Sarah barely heard any of it. She was watching Marcus, searching for some sign of the brother she remembered. He gave her nothing. Finally, there was a recess. Sarah stood to stretch her legs, her pregnant belly aching from sitting so long. David approached her. His lawyers tried to stop him, but he waved them off. His smile was back in place, the charming, reasonable smile that had fooled her for 6 years. "Sarah," he said softly, "this does not have to be ugly. We can still work something out." Sarah looked at him. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, the man who had systematically destroyed her life. "No," she said. "We cannot." David's smile tightened. "You are making a mistake. You do not want me as an enemy. I have never wanted you as anything, David." Sarah's voice was steady. "Not anymore." Something ugly flashed in his eyes. "You think that evidence will save you? You think that judge will believe a crazy woman over me?" "I think," Sarah said quietly, "that you have never actually faced consequences in your life, and I think you have no idea what is coming." David leaned closer. His breath was hot on her face. "When this is over," he whispered, "I will make sure you never see that baby again. I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a facility just like Elizabeth. And no one will believe a word you say." Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "Is that a threat, David?" "It is a promise." He turned and walked back to his table. Sarah sat down slowly. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear this time, from anticipation, because David Harrison had just made exactly the mistake she had been waiting for. When the hearing resumed, Sarah took the witness stand. Elena guided her through the testimony carefully: the marriage, the isolation, the financial control, the documents she had discovered, the first wife she had found hidden away. David's lawyers objected constantly. Marcus overruled most of them. Then came the moment Sarah had been planning for. Elena presented the evidence from the flash drive. The emails appeared on screens around the courtroom, the financial records, the recordings. David watched with growing fury as his empire unraveled in real time. "This is fabricated," he said loudly, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to silence him. "She made all of this up. She is crazy. Everyone knows she is crazy. She was committed to a psychiatric facility 2 weeks ago." Marcus's gavel struck the bench. "Mr. Harrison, you will remain silent." David ignored him. He was on his feet now, pointing at Sarah. "Do you see what she is doing? This is entrapment. This is—" "Mr. Harrison!" Marcus's voice cut through the chaos. "You will address this court with respect, or you will be held in contempt." David whirled toward the bench. "And you?" He jabbed a finger at Marcus. "How did this case end up in your court? What is your connection to her?" The courtroom went silent. Marcus stared at David for a long moment. His face was stone. "I have no personal connection to any party in this case," he said coldly. "And if you suggest otherwise, again, I will have you removed." But Sarah saw it. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the bench just a fraction too tightly. He was lying, and David, for all his flaws, was excellent at reading people. He saw it too. "You know her," David said slowly. His eyes widened as puzzle pieces clicked into place. "Mitchell. That is her maiden name. She is—" The next moments happened very fast. David crossed the courtroom in 3 quick strides. His face was twisted with rage, all pretense of charm gone. "You set this up," he snarled at Sarah. "You and your judge brother. This whole thing is a setup." Sarah stood her ground. "I told the truth, David. That is all I did. You ruined everything." His hand came up before anyone could stop him. The slap echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Sarah staggered backward, one hand flying to her burning cheek, the other to her belly. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then Victoria Chase stepped forward. Whether from panic, loyalty, or simple cruelty, she slapped Sarah again, harder. A second crack that split the shocked silence. "That is for trying to trap him," Victoria hissed. "You crazy—" Sarah fell to her knees. Blood dripped from her lip onto the marble floor. The courtroom erupted. Security guards surged forward. David's lawyers shouted objections. Journalists scrambled for their phones. The gallery exploded into chaos. But Sarah was not looking at any of them. She was looking at Marcus. Her brother rose slowly from the bench. His face had transformed. The cold, impartial mask was gone. In its place was raw fury and something else. Something she had not seen in 15 years. The fierce protectiveness of an older brother. "Bailiff," Marcus commanded. His voice shook with barely controlled rage. "Arrest both of them. Now." David was already backing away. "You cannot do this. Do you have any idea who I am? I will have you removed from the bench. I will—" "Mr. Harrison." Marcus stepped down from the bench. He walked toward David until they were face to face. "You just committed felony assault in a federal courtroom, witnessed by 40 people and 12 cameras." He paused. "I know exactly who you are." David's face went pale. "This is not— You are a predator who destroys women and calls it business." Marcus's voice was ice. "You did it to your first wife. You tried to do it to my sister. And now you have done it in front of the entire world." "Your sister?" David looked from Marcus to Sarah, then back again. Understanding dawned across his face, followed by fury. "This whole thing was a setup. You two planned—" "I did not plan anything," Marcus said, "but I am ending it." He turned to Elena. "Ms. Vasquez, please present the remaining evidence." Elena rose and clicked her laptop. The courtroom screens lit up. Emails detailing the plan to have Sarah declared incompetent. Financial records showing millions in fraudulent transfers. Recordings of David coaching Victoria on her testimony. And finally, the communications about Elizabeth Harrison. 7 years of documentation showing how David had destroyed his first wife and planned to do the same to his second. The courtroom was silent as the evidence scrolled past. David stood frozen. His empire was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Then Victoria spoke. "I did not know," she said suddenly. Her voice was shaking. "I did not know any of this. He told me she was crazy. He told me—" "Victoria," David snapped. "Shut up." "No!" Victoria's composure finally cracked. "I am not going to prison for you." She turned to Marcus. "I will cooperate. I have emails. I have texts. I have everything. He told me exactly what to do, and I have receipts." David lunged at her. More chaos. Bailiffs rushed forward. Bodies collided. Someone screamed. When the dust settled, David Harrison was on the ground in handcuffs. Still shouting threats that no longer carried any weight, Victoria Chase was sobbing in a corner, already giving a statement to investigators. And Sarah Mitchell was being helped to her feet by her brother, who held her gently, carefully, as if she might break. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly. His voice cracked. "Sarah, are you—" "I am okay," she whispered. She looked up at him. She saw the tears he was fighting. 15 years, Marcus. I thought you were gone." "I thought I had to be," he said. "After Dad. After everything. I thought the best thing I could do so for you was disappear." Sarah shook her head. "You were wrong. I know. He held her tighter. I know. Around them, the courtroom continued to swirl with activity. Journalists shouted questions. Lawyers argued. Security guards escorted David and Victoria away in separate directions, but for one moment, in the eye of the hurricane, Sarah and Marcus were simply a brother and sister reunited after 15 years of silence. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah allowed herself to believe it might actually be over. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the nursery of her new apartment, watching her daughter sleep. Grace Mitchell Harrison was 2 weeks old. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. She slept peacefully, unaware of the storm her parents had weathered just to bring her safely into the world. The apartment was modest compared to the Manhattan penthouse. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with windows that let in the afternoon sun. It was not luxurious, but it was hers. Her name was on the lease. Her money paid the rent. For the first time in years, Sarah owned her own life. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Elena Vasquez stood in the hallway, holding 2 cups of coffee and a thick folder. Brought you an update, Elena said. Also caffeine. You look like you need it. Sarah smiled tiredly. New mothers do not sleep. That is the rule. They settled onto the couch while Grace continued her peaceful slumber. David Harrison's trial date had been set. 14 federal charges, including financial fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, assault, and false imprisonment. The prosecutors were treating it as a landmark case, the kind that makes careers. His assets had been frozen, pending investigation. Harrison Capital had collapsed. Investors fled. Board members resigned. The company that had once been valued at over $2 billion was now worthless. Victoria Chase had cooperated fully. In exchange for her testimony, she had pled to accessory charges and received 18 months in minimum security. Her Instagram had gone private. Her influencer career was over. But the news that affected Sarah most deeply involved Elizabeth Harrison. David's first wife had been released from the Connecticut facility after an independent evaluation found no underlying psychiatric disorder. Her symptoms had been medically induced, the result of years of unnecessary medication prescribed based on falsified records. Elizabeth was suing David separately. She and Sarah had spoken twice on the phone, carefully, tentatively, 2 women who shared a particular kind of trauma that few others could understand. She wants to meet Grace, Sarah said quietly. Elizabeth. She asked if maybe someday she could visit. Elena nodded. That is up to you. I think I would like that. Sarah looked at her sleeping daughter. She deserves to know she was not the only one, that it happened before, and that it was never her fault. The coffee grew cold as they talked through the remaining legal details. The divorce was finalized. Sarah had been awarded full custody, the Manhattan apartment, and a significant settlement from David's frozen assets. The prenup that he had designed to protect himself had included a clause about infidelity that his own lawyers had overlooked. Poetic justice, Elena said with satisfaction. Sarah shook her head slowly. I do not feel triumphant. I know I should, but mostly I just feel tired. Elena reached over and squeezed her hand. That is normal. You have been running on adrenaline for months. Now that the danger is over, your body is catching up. When does it feel real? Elena smiled. Give it time. One day you will wake up and realize you are not afraid anymore. That day, you will know. After Elena left, Sarah sat by the window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker on as evening fell. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Can I come over? I brought dinner. And questions about how to hold a baby without breaking her. Sarah smiled and typed back. Door is unlocked, and you cannot break her. She is tougher than she looks. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later with Thai food and an expression of barely concealed terror as Sarah placed Grace in his arms for the first time. "She is so small," he said. His voice was hushed. "What if I drop her? You will not. What if she cries? Then you comfort her. What if I do it wrong?" Sarah sat down next to him on the couch. "There is no wrong way to love someone, Marcus. You just have to show up." He looked at her over their niece's sleeping head. "I should have shown up sooner. 15 years sooner." Sarah had thought about this moment many times. What she would say to the brother who had abandoned her. How she would express the hurt, the anger, the betrayal. But looking at him now, holding her daughter with such careful tenderness, she found that the anger had faded. What remained was simply gratitude that he was here at all. "You came back when it mattered," she said softly. "That is enough." "Is it?" Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "It has to be. Otherwise we spend our whole lives looking backward instead of forward." They sat in comfortable silence while Grace slept, and the city hummed outside. "I have been thinking," Marcus said eventually, "about what happens next, for you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What about? What happens next? You were a lawyer once, a good one." "That was a long time ago." Marcus shifted Grace carefully to his other arm. "Elena mentioned she could use a partner, someone who knows how these cases work from the inside." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You mean help other women, like me, like Elizabeth? There are a lot of them out there," Marcus said. "Women trapped in golden cages, women whose husbands are too rich, too powerful, too connected to fight. They need someone who understands." Sarah looked at her daughter, thought about the months of terror she had endured, the desperation, the moments when she had believed she might actually be crazy because everyone around her said she was. She also thought about Rachel Torres, who had risked everything to help a stranger because her own sister had not survived, and the nurse who had held her hand in the hospital and told her she was not alone, and Elena, who had fought for her when no one else would. Small acts of courage, rippling outward, making the impossible possible. "Vasquez and Mitchell," Sarah said slowly. "Elena mentioned that name, has a nice ring to it." Sarah smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Yeah, it does." 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the small conference room of Vasquez and Mitchell Family Law, reviewing case files before her first client of the day. The office was modest but warm. Comfortable chairs for nervous visitors, soft lighting, a box of tissues on every table, the kind of space where women felt safe enough to tell the truth. In the year since Sarah had joined Elena's practice, they had taken on 47 cases. Not all of them won. The legal system was imperfect, and powerful men had resources that ordinary women did not. But they had made a difference. 23 women had escaped abusive marriages. 15 had retained custody of their children. 8 had successfully prosecuted their abusers. And one, just last month, had walked into the office with a black eye and walked out 3 months later with a protective order, a divorce settlement, and the first genuine smile she had worn in years. That was the job now. Small victories, incremental progress. Lives rebuilt one piece at a time. Sarah's phone buzzed. A photo from Marcus. Grace at the zoo, covered in ice cream, laughing at a penguin through the glass. "She is going to need a bath," the caption read. "Possibly a hazmat team." Sarah smiled and typed back, "That is what uncles are for." Her relationship with Marcus was still healing. 15 years of silence could not be erased overnight. But they talked every week now. He visited Grace twice a month. Slowly, carefully, they were rebuilding what had been lost. Their mother had come around eventually. It had taken time for her to accept that David's version of events had been lies. When she finally understood the truth, She had wept for 3 days straight. I should have believed you, she kept saying. I should have trusted my own daughter. Sarah had forgiven her, not because the pain had disappeared, but because carrying that resentment would only poison her own recovery. Some things you had to let go, not for the other person's sake, but for your own. Elena knocked on the conference room door. Your 9 o'clock is here. Send her in. The woman who entered was in her mid-30s, well-dressed, with careful makeup that did not quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. She moved tentatively, like someone accustomed to being watched. Sarah recognized the body language immediately. The hypervigilance, the flinch response that activated at unexpected sounds. The way she positioned herself near the door, always keeping an escape route in view. Please sit down, Sarah said gently. Can I get you some water? Coffee? The woman sat on the edge of the chair, her hands twisted in her lap. I do not know if I should be here, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He says I am imagining things. He says I am paranoid. Sarah felt her heart clench. That familiar story, the same lies she had once believed about herself. She sat down across from the woman and leaned forward slightly. What is your name? The woman hesitated. Margaret. Margaret Stevens. Margaret, can I tell you something? The woman nodded, uncertain. 2 years ago, Sarah said slowly, I was sitting where you are, scared, confused, wondering if I really was crazy, like everyone kept telling me. I had a husband who drugged me, isolated me, and tried to have me committed to a psychiatric facility so he could take my baby. Margaret's eyes widened. Everyone believed him, Sarah continued. My friends, my family, the doctors, the courts. He was rich and charming, and I was just a hysterical, pregnant woman with anxiety problems. She paused. I know what it feels like to have your reality questioned by everyone around you. And I want you to know something important. What? Sarah met her eyes directly. I believe you. Whatever he has done, whatever he has told you, I believe that you are telling the truth. Margaret's composure cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, leaving tracks in her careful makeup. He is a senator, she whispered. Everyone loves him. No one will believe. I will believe you, Sarah said firmly, and I will fight for you. For the next hour, Margaret talked. The story poured out of her in fragments. The isolation, the gaslighting, the medications she was sure he was slipping into her food. The same pattern Sarah had lived through, dressed in different details. By the end, Margaret was crying openly, and Sarah was taking careful notes, already strategizing about evidence collection and protective measures. What do I do now? Margaret asked. Her voice was raw. How do I fight someone that powerful? Sarah thought about the answer carefully. This is what she had learned over the past year. This is what she told every woman who sat in that chair. The first thing you do, Sarah said, is stop blaming yourself. Whatever he did, however he manipulated you, none of it was your fault. The second thing you do is document everything. Screenshots, voice memos, a journal with dates and times, evidence that he does not know exists. And the third thing? Sarah smiled. The third thing is the most important. You trust your instincts. When someone tells you that you are crazy for believing what you see with your own eyes, that is a sign that you are seeing the truth. The gaslighting works because it makes you doubt yourself. She leaned forward. So, stop doubting. You know what is real. You know what he is doing. Trust that knowledge, even when everyone around you says otherwise. Margaret took a shaky breath. She nodded slowly. I can do that. You can, Sarah agreed. And you will not be alone. I am going to be with you every step of the way. After Margaret left, Sarah stood by the window of her office, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, David Harrison was awaiting trial. His empire in ruins, his freedom about to disappear forever. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth Harrison was rebuilding her life after 7 lost years. Somewhere out there, Rachel Torres was working at a nonprofit that helped victims of workplace harassment, turning her guilt over what she had witnessed into action that helped others. Somewhere out there, 1,000 women were trapped in golden cages, wondering if they were crazy, wondering if anyone would ever believe them. Sarah could not save all of them. She knew that. The system was broken in ways that no single person could fix. But she could save some, one at a time, case by case, story by story. And maybe, eventually, the ripples would spread far enough to change something fundamental, to shift the balance just enough that the next David Harrison would think twice before trying to destroy a woman who had done nothing wrong except marry him. Her phone buzzed again. Elena. How did it go? Sarah typed back. New client. Senator's wife. He has been drugging her. Elena's response was immediate. Same playbook? Same playbook, Sarah confirmed. They never learn, do they? Sarah looked at the case file on her desk. Margaret Stevens, another woman fighting for her life against a man who thought he was untouchable. No, she typed. They never do. But neither do we. She gathered her files, took a deep breath, and walked back to work. There was always another woman who needed help. There was always another fight to win. And Sarah Mitchell was just getting started. Now, a quick favor before we dive in. If stories about justice, survival, and women who refuse to be silenced speak to you, tap that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you will never miss a story like this one. And when you reach the part that makes your jaw drop, and trust me, you will know it when you hear it, drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in her position. I read every single one. All right, let us go back 72 hours before that satisfying courtroom, satisfying slap. Back to where it all began. Closing. Disclaimer. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful storytelling with valuable life lessons. Every detail was crafted with intention because we believe stories have the power to educate, inspire, and protect. Thank you for being here.